There is a liquid you can make at home for $2. It does not stain over the damage. It does not paint around it. It goes straight into the grain and rebuilds the wood from the inside out. Gray, cracked, sun-destroyed timber that looks one season away from the landfill comes back looking like it just left the sawmill. Craftsmen in the 1930s knew this formula by heart. Cabinet makers passed it down like a family recipe. Then, the wood restoration industry did the math. A $2 solution that replaces a $900 service cannot be allowed to spread. Hi, my name is George, and this is Buried Secrets. This is where we dig up what the industry spent decades and billions of dollars trying to make sure you never find. To understand why this formula works, you have to go back further than 1939, much further. About 20,000 years further, give or take a coffee break. The flax plant is one of the oldest cultivated crops in human history. Ancient Mesopotamian farmers grew it for fiber and seed before the wheel existed, before written language, before cities, before anyone had thought to put two stones together and call it a road. And yet, they already understood that the seed of this plant produced something extraordinary. Something that protected organic material from the one enemy that has never stopped trying to destroy everything we build: time. Egyptian burial chambers contain linen cloth woven from flax that is still structurally intact after 4,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. 4,000 years. Your deck cannot survive four Minnesota winters without peeling, graying, and quietly rotting from the inside out. But Egyptian linen woven from the same plant family is still holding together in a climate-controlled museum case. The difference is not the material. It is what they knew about protecting it. Knowledge that existed long before any corporation decided that knowledge was worth more kept secret than shared freely. In ancient China, woodworkers discovered that pressing flax seeds produced a golden oil that soaked deep into timber and hardened over weeks into a flexible, water-resistant shield. This was the first wood finish ever recorded in human history. Not a product engineered in a laboratory. Not a formula developed by a research division with a marketing budget attached. Oil from a seed, pressed by hand, rubbed into wood with a cloth. That is the entire secret. That is what 20,000 years of human civilization across every continent and every culture that worked with timber quietly arrived at independently and agreed on without ever holding a single meeting about it. By the medieval period, European cabinet makers, shipbuilders, and cathedral craftsmen had refined the process. They mixed raw linseed oil with metallic compounds to accelerate drying time, creating what became known as boiled linseed oil. Cathedral doors in Germany treated with this method in the 1500s are still standing today. Still standing, still solid, still doing the job they were built to do 5 centuries ago. Meanwhile, your garden furniture has been rotting since the second Obama administration. British naval vessels coated their deck timbers with linseed oil before crossing the Atlantic, and those decks survived salt spray, tropical sun, and cannon fire. Not because the wood was exceptional, because the treatment was right. The formula was not complicated. It was not secret. It was not the exclusive property of a guild or a trade or a corporation with a patent portfolio. It was simply understood. Every craftsman knew it. Every apprentice learned it. In their first week on the floor, the knowledge passed from hand to hand the way useful knowledge always does. Not through a sales funnel, but through the basic human instinct to share what works. And then, somewhere between the invention of television and the invention of the credit card, we forgot. In 1860, a British inventor named Frederick Walton left a can of linseed oil open overnight in his London workshop. The next morning, a rubbery skin had formed on the surface, harder than varnish, more flexible than lacquer. Walton spent 3 years perfecting that reaction, and by 1863, he had invented linoleum, the first mass-produced floor covering in history, built entirely on one ingredient. One ingredient that costs $4 a quart at your hardware store right now, assuming you can find it behind the $40 bottles of rebranded versions sitting in front of it. By the 1930s, craftsmen across America had combined linseed oil with 2 other ingredients to create a wood restoration formula that worked on everything: rotting fence posts, sun-cracked porch boards, antique furniture dried out from decades in an unheated attic. Cabinet makers in rural workshops from Maine to Montana knew this formula the way they knew their own hands. They did not call it a trade secret. They did not charge a consultation fee to share it. They called it common sense. And then the 1950s happened. And common sense became the one thing the industry could not afford to let you keep. The chemistry. Here is what happens at the molecular level when this liquid meets damaged wood. And I promise, this is the only part that sounds like a chemistry class. Stay with me, because this is the part that explains why everything the industry has been selling you for the last 70 years has been failing on a schedule somebody planned in advance and nobody bothered to mention to you. Linseed oil is a triglyceride with an unusually high concentration of alpha-linolenic acid, a polyunsaturated fatty acid that reacts with oxygen through a process scientists call oxidative polymerization. I know that sounds like something you would skip past in a textbook. Do not skip it. Because that reaction is the entire reason this formula works when everything else eventually stops working. When linseed oil meets wood, it does not behave the way paint behaves. It does not behave the way varnish behaves. It does not behave the way any of the $30 branded products on the restoration aisle behave. It does not sit on the surface. It does not form a shell. It does not wait on top of the grain like a lid on a jar, hoping nothing cracks it open and lets the weather in underneath. It goes into the wood, deep into the cellular structure of the timber itself, down into the fibers, into the pores, into the microscopic spaces that decades of sun and rain and freeze and thaw have slowly hollowed out. And once inside, the fatty acid chains begin to cross-link with each other and with the wood fibers themselves, forming a flexible polymer network that fills every void, every crack, every dried-out cell that time has emptied. The wood does not get coated, it gets rebuilt. From the inside. A study published in the Journal of Coatings Technology confirmed that linseed oil penetrates wood up to 4 times deeper than synthetic polyurethane. 4 times deeper. That number matters more than almost anything else in this conversation, because depth is the difference between a treatment that lasts and a treatment that is already failing the moment you finish applying it. Polyurethane sits on top of the grain like a plastic shell. It looks good on day one. It photographs well. It impresses the neighbor who walks past while you are still cleaning your brush. And then, winter arrives. The wood expands and contracts. The shell does not expand and contract with it, because plastic and timber do not move at the same rate. And they never will. A crack forms. It might be invisible to the naked eye at first, barely a hairline. But moisture does not need a wide opening. Moisture needs any opening. Water gets underneath the shell. The bond between the coating and the wood surface begins to break. And from that point forward, the deterioration happens in the one place you cannot see it and cannot reach it. Underneath the finish, inside the wood. Until one spring morning, you walk out onto your deck and the entire surface is blistering and peeling and gray. And the contractor you call gives you a number that starts with $900 and goes up from there. That failure is not bad luck. It is not poor application technique. It is not because you bought the wrong brand or skipped a prep step. The failure is structural. It is built into the chemistry of the product from the beginning. A product that fails predictably is a product that gets repurchased predictably. And predictable repurchasing is the entire foundation of a $1.9 billion industry. White vinegar, which is simply acetic acid, does something the synthetic products cannot replicate. It cuts through decades of surface oxidation, grime, and dead finish without disturbing the healthy wood fibers underneath. It clears the way, strips the gray, exposes the living grain that has been buried under years of weathering and failed coatings. And the moment that grain is exposed, the linseed oil floods in and begins its work immediately. Turpentine, a natural solvent distilled from pine resin and used by craftsmen since the ancient Greeks, thins the oil just enough to let it travel further and faster than it would on its own. Without it, the oil penetrates well. With it, the oil reaches places inside the timber that no synthetic product in any bottle on any shelf has ever touched. 3 ingredients. 1 jar. A total cost of under $2 per application. And chemistry that 20,000 years of human observation quietly agreed on long before any patent office opened its doors and decided that nature needed a licensing fee. The suppression. Here is what changed everything. The petrochemical industry emerged from the Second World War with enormous manufacturing capacity, enormous political influence, and an enormous problem. They had built factories, distribution networks, and sales teams around synthetic products, polyurethane, chemical lacquers, and alkyd resin primers. These products were shinier than linseed oil, faster to apply, and dramatically more profitable to manufacture. Linseed oil cost pennies per gallon to produce. Synthetic finishes cost dollars. And more importantly, synthetic finishes failed on a predictable schedule. That word is important. Predictable. Because a product that fails predictably is a product that gets repurchased predictably. And predictable repurchasing is the foundation of every successful consumer business model in history. So the industry had a formula that worked permanently, cost almost nothing, could not be patented because it came from a plant, and required no repeat purchase. And they had investors who needed quarterly returns. You can probably guess which one lost. By the 1960s, linseed oil had been quietly pushed to the back corner of hardware store shelves. University architecture programs stopped teaching passive wood treatment. Home improvement television featured segment after segment showcasing branded synthetic products. The algorithm of that era was the television commercial. And the television commercial had no interest in a formula that put itself out of business after one application. The wood restoration product market today is valued at $1.9 billion. It is dominated by corporations like Sherwin-Williams, 3M, and a dozen brands you recognize from 30-second spots during football games. Pull the safety data sheet on any major oil-based wood restore products sold in the United States. In the chemical composition section, you will find linseed oil derivatives listed as the primary active ingredient. They took the $4 quart, added petroleum solvents, poured it into a bottle with aggressive branding, and charged you $40 for the privilege of not knowing what you just bought. That is not innovation. That is just a really good label. You cannot patent linseed oil because it is a natural product that has existed for thousands of years. You cannot patent vinegar because it is acetic acid, one of the oldest chemicals known to humanity. You cannot patent turpentine because it has been distilled from pine trees since the ancient Greeks. There is no proprietary molecule, no trade secret, no intellectual property to protect. And what cannot be patented cannot generate licensing fees. What cannot be licensed cannot build a brand monopoly. And what cannot build a brand monopoly cannot justify a $40 price tag on a $4 ingredient. So they made sure you never learned the difference. And it worked. For 70 years it worked beautifully. Until now. The vault. Before I go any further, I need to stop and tell you something. This video is just the surface. I have spent months pulling together everything the industry has buried into one place, the complete Buried Secrets Vault. The vault includes a tannic acid rust elimination guide that permanently stops corrosion on every tool and vehicle you own for $3. It includes an earth battery blueprint that generates usable electricity from 2 pieces of metal pushed into wet soil, a Trom wall passive heating system that slashes your heating bill by 47% using only concrete, glass, and sunlight, an atmospheric water generator that pulls clean drinking water from thin air, a biochar water filter that purifies contaminated water for under $15, and now the complete wood restoration formula guide, covering every wood type, every surface, and every condition. Over 10 guides in one vault, 0 filler. Every page built for immediate action. The link is in the description right now, but stay right here, because what comes next is the part the contractors really do not want you to hear. What this actually means for you. Here is what the industry does not want you to sit down and calculate. The national average cost to refinish a 200 square foot deck is $900 to $2,700. Contractors recommend you do it every 2 to 3 years. Over 20 years of homeownership, that is a single wooden platform behind your house, costing you potentially over $15,000. $15,000 for a deck. That keeps failing because the product it was treated with was engineered to fail. A $1.9 billion industry depends entirely on that cycle continuing. On you never opening a chemistry textbook. On you never reading the ingredients label on the back of that $40 bottle. On you never asking why the formula your great-grandmother mixed in a glass jar and applied with a cotton rag worked better than anything on the shelf at your hardware store today. She did not have a marketing budget. She did not have a branded spray can or an influencer endorsement or a 30-second television spot. She had 3 ingredients, equal parts, 1 jar, and chemistry that 20,000 years of human civilization quietly agreed was the answer. Cabinet makers in 1939 mixed this formula in glass jars before the ink was dry on the first polyurethane patent. Victorian homeowners maintained their oak floors with it and called it basic housekeeping. Cathedral builders in 1500 Germany treated their doors with it, and those doors are still standing today. Not because the wood was special, because the formula was right, and then one generation stopped passing it down. Not because anyone made a law against it, not because the formula failed a single test, because a television commercial told them there was a better way, and the better way happened to cost $40 a bottle and need replacing every 18 months. There was no better way, there was just a more profitable way. Now here is the one thing I will not skip, because other channels do skip it, and someone always ends up paying for it in the worst possible way. Rags soaked in linseed oil can spontaneously combust if left crumpled in a pile. This is not theoretical. In 1991, a fire caused by linseed oil-soaked rags destroyed the Meridian Plaza in Philadelphia and killed 3 firefighters. Spread your rags flat to dry outdoors, or submerge them in water inside a sealed metal container before disposing. This is not optional. This is the one step where cutting corners has consequences that cannot be undone. Everything else about this formula is simple, embarrassingly simple. The kind of simple that makes you feel a very specific emotion somewhere between relief and mild fury when you fully understand what has been kept from you. That emotion is appropriate. I felt it too. Boiled linseed oil, white distilled vinegar, turpentine, equal parts, 1 glass jar, 1 cotton rag, under $2, available at any hardware store on earth. The gray deck you have been avoiding all summer could look brand new by this weekend. The fence your neighbor keeps suggesting you tear out and replace could be standing and restored before dinner tonight. The antique table sitting in your garage looking like it quietly gave up on life could be back in your dining room looking like it never aged a single day. The wood did not die. The knowledge was just buried. And buried, as it turns out, is not the same thing as gone. $1.9 billion in annual wood restoration revenue depends on you never connecting those dots. $15,000 per deck over a lifetime of home ownership depends on you believing that wood care requires specialized, branded, expensive products with names you recognize from television. $40 bottles of repackaged linseed oil derivatives depend on you never once turning the bottle around and reading what is actually inside. But chemistry does not negotiate with marketing departments. Linseed oil does not expire. And flax plants have been growing in every field on Earth, completely free of charge, for longer than any corporation has existed. This knowledge did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it worked so well that an entire industry had to quietly agree to stop mentioning it. And that agreement held for 70 years, until now. If this vault opened something for you today, subscribe and share it with one person who is about to spend $1,000 on a contractor who already knows everything you just learned. Every share puts a crack in the wall. They spent billions building around something they never had the right to hide. Every subscription keeps buried secrets digging deeper into the vaults they assumed were sealed forever. My name is George. This is Buried Secrets. The next vault opens soon, and what is inside is going to make the energy industry very uncomfortable.